Mr. Thomsen.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation, and hello to everybody. Hello, Thomas. So I think this is a very timely debate. What can we learn from how we dealt with the Greek crisis? Because I personally think that we are at the risk of repeating some of the mistakes that we did back in dealing with the Greek crisis. And let me say in this regard, I certainly look at the situation quite different from I did in 2010. Let me make four brief points, four brief succinct points. The first one is that I am quite pessimistic about Greece's ability to prosper within the Eurozone. I'm here looking at 10, 20 years. What happened beyond that, I don't know. And my views are very much rooted in what we have heard today, the clientelism of the system, and Mr. Papandreou just brought it out very clearly. The decision to admit Greece to the euro was clearly a political one that had no basis in economic realities. It was based on this notion that if you put a country in a straitjacket, politicians would be forced to adopt the necessary reforms. That has proven naive. It has not happened. It didn't happen before the crisis, has not happened since. Greece was forced in 2012 by the Europeans and the IMF to adopt some pretty important labor market reforms, and in 2015 to some pension and tax reforms that would have made the fiscal policy much more growth friendly. But these reforms were either not implemented or later reversed. So and you might say that the current government is doing things. Yes, I know it's sort of picking up on privatization, some digitalization, but this is really tinkering on the margins compared to what really needs to be done in a world where everybody else are doing a structural reform. I don't see Greece closing gaps. I see it will struggle to prevent that its young people will continue to leave Greece in large numbers to seek a better life abroad, all because of the clientelism that we have discussed this morning. This leads me to my second point. The 2010 program was clearly much too optimistic in its assumptions about economic growth because of my first point. This meant also we were far too optimistic about Greece's debt servicing capacity. This does not mean, I would stress, that we should have insisted on a debt restructuring in May 2010. I still think, given the lack of a firewall, a crisis resolution mechanism, we had no other choice than bailing out creditors at the time. But I think we, certainly the IMF at that time, with the benefit of hindsight, should have insisted with the Europeans, with Germany, that once these firewalls are in place, there will be a debt structuring. We didn't do that, and what really happened with the bailout of creditors ended up in what should have been a fairly straightforward technical issue of debt restructuring, ended up becoming hopelessly politicized by being sort of this north-south focal point with all the sensitivities about transfer union. And I think that was, in retrospect, a serious mistake. My third point is on debt sustainability analysis. They are not only wrong, they are also irrelevant. And here I'm talking both about what the IMF is doing and what European institutions are doing. European institutions attempt to justify the high debt by providing debt sustainability analysis that goes off far into the future and shows that over the very, 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 very long run, at some day in the future, debt can become sustainable. They are based on growth assumptions that are not consistent with the political realities regarding reforms. But more important, of course, any solvency problem can be shown to be a liquidity problem if you allow projection period for several decades or many decades. That's not credible. That's not a credible projections And creditors would, of course, not consider it credible. They would know that the country will be a sitting duck for decades, waiting for the next, while debt is slowly going down, waiting for the next crisis to blow it off course. But in the euro area, creditors has been willing to accept it. Why? Because they know they will be bailed out. It's and this brings me to the what I think is the overarching conclusion from the euro crisis. The euro crisis has not created any meaningful progress towards a political union, but and certainly not as far as reforms and fiscal is concerned. One can argue with the SSM and the financial sector there have been some progress. But on fiscal policy and reforms, the things that matter for real convergence, we are not anywhere closer to a political union. But what the euro crisis did, true to the bailouts, the Troika bailouts, and in particular the ECB's promise to do whatever it takes, it means that creditors are just not interested in debt levels as long as they can be persuaded that they will be bailed out. I have gone to endless investor conferences in Greece, in Italy, and others where investors are not really interested in the local policies, but in whether Europe is going to bail out whatever happens. So I think all these debt sustainability analyses are largely irrelevant, and we certainly in the IMF failed to understand that by providing debt sustainability analysis that did not take into account that this is a currency union where other countries are supportive, but the Europeans, on the other hand, sort of have these projections that shows that one day we will get there over the very long run. The critical issue here is, of course, that while we have these bailouts, we have nothing to ensure that the countries use these bailouts as a breathing space to do the right thing. And we have a moral hazard problem. And let me give you one observation, which is actually quite spectacular if you think about it. All Europe's high debt countries entered the COVID crisis with debt levels at or above the already elevated levels with which they had exited the euro crisis. Despite the fact that they had a huge increase in debt, they did nothing to bring it down in the anticipation that they would be bailed out. And they were right. They were bailed out. I'm not saying one should not have done what one did recently under the COVID crisis. There's a strong humanitarian case for that, but we should not fool ourselves. It is a bailout. It's a bailout in a situation where Europe does not have a mechanism for ensuring that the countries do the right thing, and we should certainly expect the need for more bailouts down the road. My fourth and last point is very related to this. This COVID crisis will, despite the mutualization and grants coming from the European Recovery Fund, entail a huge increase in indebtedness of countries and increased debt levels of the already indebted countries to very high level. There will be pressures for more austerity down the road. There are significant pressures for austerity. Of course, this is politically unsustainable, and of course there will be strong tensions, north-south tensions, and pressures for debt restructuring and bailouts. This time around, it's not happening through the ESM, which is too small, but through the European Central Bank, which means that I cannot see how the European Central Bank can avoid to be severely politicized in the future the way we are handling this crisis. I, of course, understand why here in the midst of the crisis, policymakers would not want to insist on a debt restructuring of the highly indebted countries. But let's not fool ourselves. Once we are over the crisis, there will be a need for this debt to be written off. And of course, we're already seeing pressures from Italy for the ECB to write off the papers that it's buying under its asset purchase program. One way or the other, there will be a need for debt restructuring, and it will be very noisy, very political. But this COVID crisis will dramatically increase north-south tensions down the road. I'll stop here.